Hey everyone, and welcome back to Study Hall, where we take these deep dives into all sorts of fascinating topics.
That's right. We like to roll up our sleeves and really get our hands dirty with the information.
And today's topic is a real doozy.
Oh, yeah. Buckle up because this one's going to be a bumpy ride.
We're talking about a recent executive order that's causing quite a stir in the world of government.
It's got people talking, debating, even scratching their heads a little bit.
And for good reason, because this order aims to eliminate a long-standing institution, the Federal Executive Institute, or as it's more commonly known, the FEI.
The FEI, it's been around for decades. It was established back in 1968.
It's basically been the go-to training ground for high-ranking federal employees, kind of like a leadership boot camp for the folks running the show.
Exactly. It's where they go to learn the ropes, the ins and outs of navigating the complexities of government, making tough decisions, managing large teams, all that good stuff.
So you can imagine the shockwaves that went through the system when this executive order landed on everyone's desks.
It's like pulling the rug out from under a whole generation of government leaders.
And the order doesn't mince words. It's pretty strong in its language.
Oh, yeah, it uses terms like entrenched bureaucracy and Washington, D.C. managerial class. It's definitely painting a picture of an out-of-touch elite.
It's like they're saying, out with the old guard, in with a new way of doing things.
A leaner, meaner, more efficient government. That's a goal, at least according to the order.
But is it really that simple? I mean, we've got a stack of research here, a whole bunch of reports, articles, expert opinions, and it seems like there are some strong arguments both for and against eliminating the FEI.
It's a mixed bag, for sure.
So let's start with the potential upsides, shall we?
Let's do it.
One of the biggest arguments in favor of getting rid of the FEI is cost savings.
Ah, yes, the good old budget argument.
And it's a valid one, right? I mean, according to our sources, the FEI costs taxpayers millions of dollars every year.
Millions. That's a lot of dough.
So the thinking is, if you eliminate the FEI, you free up those funds, and you can redirect them towards other programs that directly benefit the American people.
Like education, healthcare infrastructure, all those things that folks really care about.
Exactly. It's like trimming the fat,
Yeah.
getting rid of unnecessary expenses so you can focus on the essentials.
And it plays right into this idea of a more efficient government, one that's less focused on internal training and more on delivering tangible results for citizens.
Right. It's like streamlining a business. You get rid of unnecessary steps to save time and money, and hopefully those savings translate into a better product or service for the customer.
In this case, the customer being the American public.
Exactly. And that brings us to another potential benefit, reducing bureaucracy.
Ah, yes, the dreaded B word.
It seems like everyone's against bureaucracy these days, but it's important to remember that not all bureaucracy is bad.
That's right. It's all about finding the right balance.
It's exactly. But in this case, the argument is that by eliminating the FEI, you're cutting out a layer of what some perceive as unnecessary training and administrative overhead.
Less paperwork, fewer hoops to jump through, the kind of stuff that can really bog down the system.
So in theory, this could lead to faster decision-making, more streamlined processes, and ultimately a more responsive government that's better equipped to serve the needs of its citizens.
It's a seductive idea, right? This vision of a leaner, meaner government that's actually getting things done.
But the question is, does it actually work in practice? I mean, is eliminating a training program really going to address the root causes of bureaucratic inefficiency?
That's where things start to get a little murky.
Because while the potential benefits sound pretty appealing, there's a whole other side to this coin, and frankly, some of those potential downsides are pretty worrying.
Oh, yeah. We're just getting started, folks.
The big one that keeps coming up is the risk of a leadership vacuum within the federal workforce.
You're basically taking away a key training ground for the people who are supposed to be leading the government.
And it's not just about training individuals. It's about building a network of experienced leaders who can share their knowledge and mentor others and help navigate the complexities of government.
It's like losing a library full of valuable texts and historical records.
Yeah.
You might be able to find that information elsewhere, but it's going to take time, effort, and a lot of digging.
And in the meantime, you've lost a valuable resource that could have helped you make better decisions and avoid costly mistakes.
Speaking of costly mistakes, that brings us to another major concern, the potential for long-term costs to actually outweigh any short-term savings.
Now, this is where things get really interesting. And this is where I start to get a little nervous. Because while eliminating the FEI might look good on paper in terms of immediate budget cuts, what happens when those untrained leaders start making decisions that lead to inefficiencies, mismanagement, or even outright disasters?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? You might save a few bucks now, but what about the costs down the road?
It's like neglecting routine maintenance on your car to save money in the short term, only to end up with a major breakdown that costs you even more down the road.
Exactly, or like skipping your annual doctor's appointment to save on the copay, only to end up with a serious health problem later on.
Okay, maybe that's a little dramatic, but you get the point. It's about thinking long-term, about investing in the things that will pay off in the long run.
And when it comes to government, that means investing in people, in their skills, in their ability to lead effectively.
So the question is, are we shooting ourselves in the foot by eliminating a program that has, for decades, played a role in developing those very skills within the federal workforce? Or are we sacrificing long-term effectiveness for the sake of short-term political gains?
It's a tough call, and there's no easy answer.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground here. I know it's a lot to take in. We've explored the potential benefits of eliminating the FEI, the cost savings, the reduced bureaucracy, the renewed focus on serving the public.
But we've also delved into the potential downsides, the risk of a leadership vacuum, a brain drain, and ultimately a less effective and more costly government in the long run.
So before we move on, I want to pause and hear from you, our astute listeners. What are your initial thoughts on this executive order? What jumps out at you as the most compelling argument for or against eliminating the FEI? And what questions are swirling in your mind as we continue to unpack this complex issue?
We're all in this together, folks. So let's engage those critical thinking skills and dive deeper into this fascinating topic.
We'll be back in a jiffy to continue our exploration. Don't go anywhere.
Welcome back to Study Hall, where we're picking apart this pretty hefty executive order, trying to figure out what it all means for the future of the federal government.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to solve one of those, those really complicated puzzles with like 1,000 pieces.
And every time you think you've got one piece in place, two more pop out.
Exactly. And this particular puzzle has a lot of pieces to it. We've got budgets, we've got training programs, we've got people's careers, we've got the whole question of how to make government more efficient and effective.
It's a big tangled mess.
But that's why we're here.
Yeah.
Right? To try to make sense of it all.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I think is really important to keep in mind is that behind all the talk of budgets and acronyms, there are real people whose lives are going to be affected by this decision.
Yeah, we can't lose sight of the human element in all of this.
Right. And so I think it's helpful to kind of step back and try to imagine what this might feel like from the perspective of someone who actually works in the federal government.
Like, let's say you're a federal employee. You've been working hard, you're dedicated to public service, you're looking to move up the ladder, maybe take on more responsibility.
And then, bam, this program, this opportunity to develop your leadership skills and prepare for those bigger roles, it's gone.
Just like that.
Yeah, it's got to be a tough pill to swallow.
I mean, not only are you losing a valuable resource, but it's also kind of a blow to your morale, right? Like the government is basically saying, we don't really care about investing in your professional development.
Yeah, it sends a pretty mixed message.
And what about the folks who are just starting their careers in government? You know, the bright young things who are all gung-ho about public service.
Yeah, what kind of signal does this send to them?
It's like saying, welcome aboard, but don't expect us to invest in your future.
Not exactly the best way to attract and retain top talent.
And that brings us to one of the most worrying potential consequences of this decision, the brain drain.
Yes, the classic brain drain scenario.
You basically have this situation where talented individuals who could be making a real difference in government decide to take their skills elsewhere.
Because they see that there's no real path for advancement within the federal government.
It's like trying to run a marathon with one shoe on.
You might make it to the finish line, but it's going to be a lot harder and a lot more painful.
And in the long run, it's the government that loses out because they're not able to attract and retain the best and brightest minds.
And that could have serious implications for the quality of government services across the board.
Yeah, think about it. Healthcare, education, infrastructure, national security, all of these things depend on having competent people in government.
And if the government isn't investing in its workforce, how can it expect to deliver high-quality services to its citizens?
It's like neglecting to maintain a vital piece of machinery. You might save some money in the short term, but eventually it's going to break down and cost you a lot more to fix.
And the costs of a government breakdown can be pretty high.
We're talking about people's lives, their well-being, their livelihoods.
Exactly. So it's not just some abstract budgetary issue. This is about real-world consequences that could affect all of us.
And it's not just about the potential for a brain drain either. There's also the question of what happens to the morale of the people who stay in government.
Right. If you're a federal employee and you see that the government isn't investing in your professional development, how motivated are you going to be to do your best work?
It's like telling a team of athletes that their coach has been fired and their training facility shutting down. They might still be able to practice on their own, but they're not going to be as motivated or as focused.
And that lack of motivation can have a real impact on productivity and
Uh,
effectiveness.
So we've got this potential brain drain on one hand, and we've got the risk of a demoralized and disengaged workforce on the other hand. It's not a pretty picture.
No, it's not.
And then there's the whole question of institutional knowledge.
Ah, yes, the wisdom of the elders.
Exactly. The FEI hasn't just been a training ground. It's also been a place where experienced leaders have come together to share their knowledge and mentor the next generation.
That's like a living library of government expertise.
And when you eliminate a program like that, you're not just cutting costs, you're also losing a valuable repository of knowledge and experience.
And how do you replace that? You can't just download it from the internet?
It takes time. It takes effort. It takes a deliberate investment in cultivating leadership.
And it takes a willingness to learn from the people who have been there and done that.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the impact on the federal workforce, but now I want to shift gears and talk about the people on the other side of the equation, the folks who rely on government services.
The everyday citizens.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How could this decision affect their lives in tangible ways?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because ultimately the purpose of government is to serve the needs of its citizens.
So let's play out a few scenarios, shall we?
Let's do it.
Let's start with something everyone can relate to: taxes.
Everyone's favorite topic.
Imagine it's tax season. You're trying to file your return online, and the IRS website crashes.
Or you're on hold for hours trying to get a question answered.
Or your refund gets delayed because of some bureaucratic snafu. Frustrating, right?
Absolutely. And these are the kinds of issues that can become more frequent and more severe if government agencies aren't run efficiently and effectively.
Because if you don't have skilled leaders in place, things can start to fall apart pretty quickly.
Exactly. And it's not just about taxes either. Think about healthcare, Social Security, infrastructure projects, disaster response. All of these essential services depend on a competent and well-functioning government.
Let's take the example of a natural disaster, say a hurricane or a major earthquake.
Right.
In those situations, a swift and coordinated government response is crucial to saving lives and providing aid to those affected.
Absolutely. You need clear communication, efficient resource allocation, and strong leadership at all levels to ensure that help gets to those who need it most.
But what happens if the agencies responsible for disaster response are understaffed, undertrained, and lacking effective leadership?
Well, you could end up with delays in aid delivery, confusion, and miscommunication, and ultimately a less effective response that puts more lives at risk.
Exactly, and that's just one example of how the quality of government services can be directly impacted by the skills and capabilities of the federal workforce.
So it's not just about abstract notions of efficiency and bureaucracy. It's about real-world consequences that can affect people's health, safety, and well-being.
And those consequences can be disproportionately felt by the most vulnerable members of society, the folks who rely most heavily on government services and support.
The people who often have the least amount of power and influence.
Exactly. So we've painted a rather bleak picture here, haven't we? But is there any hope? Are there any potential silver linings to this cloud of uncertainty?
Well, one possible outcome is that this shakeup could actually lead to a much-needed modernization of the federal workforce.
So instead of viewing this as a purely negative event, maybe we should see it as an opportunity to rethink and reinvent how we approach leadership development within the federal government.
Exactly. It could be a chance to break free from the old ways of doing things and come up with something new and innovative.
Like maybe instead of having this one centralized program, the FEI, you could have more specialized training programs that are tailored to the specific needs of different agencies and roles.
Right. You could have programs for managers and healthcare programs, for leaders in law enforcement programs, for folks working in cybersecurity, all sorts of different specialized training programs.
And you could leverage technology to create online learning modules, virtual simulations, personalized coaching programs, all sorts of cool stuff.
It's like taking a tired old recipe and giving it a modern makeover. You keep the core ingredients, but you add some new spices, some fresh techniques, and maybe even a little bit of fusion flair.
And the result could be a more flavorful, more nutritious, and ultimately more satisfying meal.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've gone from potential disaster to cautious optimism. But I think it's important to acknowledge that even if the government does embrace innovation and invest in new approaches to leadership development, there will still be challenges to overcome.
Absolutely. One of the biggest challenges will be ensuring that these new programs are actually effective.
Right. It's one thing to create a bunch of training materials and offer a bunch of workshops, but how do you know if they're actually making a difference?
That's a great question. And it's not always easy to measure the impact of leadership development programs.
Because it's not like you can just give someone a test and say, okay, you've passed Leadership 101, now you're a great leader.
Right. It's a lot more nuanced than that.
But there are ways to measure the effectiveness of these programs. You can track things like employee performance, job satisfaction rates, even things like the number of innovative ideas that are being generated within an agency.
And you can also get feedback from the participants themselves. Ask them what they've learned, how they've applied that knowledge to their work, whether they feel like they've grown as leaders.
So it's all about being intentional about how you design and implement these programs, and then tracking the results to see what's working and what's not.
Exactly. And being willing to make adjustments along the way, because what works for one agency or one individual might not work for another.
It's all about finding the right mix of ingredients, the right blend of skills and knowledge, the right balance of theory and practice to create a recipe for success.
And speaking of recipes, it's about that time for us to take a little break and give our listeners a chance to digest all this information.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the potential downsides of eliminating the FEI to the glimmers of hope that innovation might bring.
So before we move on to our final segment, we want to hear from you. What are your key takeaways from this discussion? What aspects of this issue are you most concerned about? And what questions are still swirling in your mind?
Share your insights, your concerns, and your queries. We'll be back shortly to delve even deeper into this fascinating and complex topic. Welcome back to Study Hall, everyone. Feels like we've been wrestling with this executive order for hours.
Yeah, I know, right? It's a real head-scratcher.
Trying to figure out if getting rid of the FEI is a brilliant move or a total blunder.
It's like one of those, those magic eye pictures where you have to stare at it for ages to see the hidden image?
Yeah, you're not wrong. It's definitely not a clear-cut issue.
Lots of layers, lots of nuances, lots of potential unintended consequences.
And that's what makes it so fascinating, right?
Yeah.
It's not just some simple yes or no question.
It's about trying to understand the bigger picture, all the interconnected parts, all the potential ripple effects.
And it's about recognizing that there are no easy answers when it comes to government reform.
Right. It's not like you can just wave a magic wand and poof, everything is fixed.
If only it were that easy.
Yeah, right. But in all seriousness, I think it's helpful to take a step back and really think about what we mean when we talk about government bureaucracy.
Because that phrase gets thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean?
Well, at its core, bureaucracy is just a system for managing complex organizations.
So it's not inherently a bad thing.
No, not at all. In fact, you need some level of bureaucracy to make sure that things run smoothly and efficiently.
Especially in a massive organization like the federal government.
Right. I mean, think about all the different agencies, all the different programs, all the different rules and regulations. It's a lot to keep track of.
So you need some kind of system to manage all of that complexity.
Exactly. And that's where bureaucracy comes in. It provides a framework for decision-making, for allocating resources, for establishing accountability.
So it's like the scaffolding that holds the whole building up.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
But I guess the problem is that sometimes that scaffolding can get a little bit too, a little bit too much.
Too much scaffolding, not enough building.
Exactly. When bureaucracy becomes an end in itself rather than a means to an end, that's when things start to go wrong.
Right. You get bogged down in paperwork, you get lost in layers of approvals, you lose sight of the bigger picture, which is serving the public.
It's like building a house with so many walls and doors that you can't even find your way around.
Yeah, or like trying to navigate a maze with no exit.
And that's where this whole debate about the FEI gets so interesting, because the argument is that by eliminating this one program, you're somehow streamlining the entire system. You're cutting out a layer of bureaucracy that's perceived as unnecessary and wasteful.
It's like they're saying, let's get rid of this one wall and suddenly the whole house will be more spacious.
But as we've discussed, it's not that simple, is it? Because even if the FEI was contributing to some level of bureaucratic bloat eliminating a line, it also carries the risk of creating other problems down the line.
Yeah, it's like trying to fix a leaky faucet by ripping out the entire plumbing system.
You might stop the leak, but you've also created a whole new set of problems that are going to be a lot harder to fix.
Exactly. So I think the key takeaway here is that there's no magic bullet when it comes to reforming government. It's not about finding one program to cut or one policy to change.
It's about taking a more holistic approach, understanding the interconnectedness of all the different parts, and making strategic decisions that are based on evidence and a deep understanding of the potential consequences.
Right. It's like a giant ecosystem. You can't just go in and tweak one thing without affecting everything else.
And you have to be willing to accept that there will always be trade-offs.
Mm.
You can't eliminate all bureaucracy without sacrificing some level of order and efficiency. You can't streamline every process without potentially cutting corners and compromising quality.
It's all about finding that sweet spot, that balance between efficiency and effectiveness, between streamlining and safeguarding, between cutting costs and investing in the future.
And at the end of the day, it's about making sure that the government is serving the needs of its citizens, not the other way around.
Well said. So where does that leave us? I mean, we've talked about all the potential pros and cons. We've explored the different perspectives. We've even tried to imagine what this might feel like for the people who are actually going to be affected by this decision.
But the million-dollar question is still unanswered. Will eliminating the FEI ultimately lead to a more efficient and effective government that truly serves the needs of the American people?
And honestly, I don't think anyone knows the answer to that question for sure.
It's like one of those choose-your-own-adventure books. We've come to a fork in the road, and we don't know which path to take.
But that's the beauty of it, isn't it? We get to be a part of this unfolding story. We get to watch and see how things play out, and we get to use our voices to shape the future of our government.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, right? It's about we the people engaging in these tough conversations, making informed decisions, and working together to create a better future for ourselves and for generations to come.
So keep those thinking caps on, folks. Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep learning, because the more we know, the better equipped we are to make a difference.
And on that note, we're going to wrap things up for today. But the conversation doesn't have to end here.
No, definitely not. We want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this whole FEI issue? What are you most concerned about? What questions do you still have?
Head over to our website, leave us a comment, send us an email. Let's keep this conversation going.
And in the meantime, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brains buzzing.
Thanks for joining us on Study Hall, everyone. We'll see you next time.